for joining us today. And we're very lucky today to have Dr. Peter Yarsky from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's been there for pretty much all of his career after a PhD in MIT from nuclear engineering, after an undergraduate degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic in upstate New York. He spends his daytime studying nuclear reactors with multi-physics analysis and thermal hydraulics and neutronics, and we've been lucky enough to hear him talk about those things in the past. But like a handful of other people in our field, about a year ago, he recognized that a lot of the mathematical models for modeling a pandemic have a lot of similarities to the models we're pretty familiar with as nuclear engineers. And so he decided to throw away all that new free time he had and use it to study this problem. And so he's going to share with us today some of the things that he learned and some of the approaches he took to understanding and modeling the coronavirus pandemic. So please, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be able to present my work today. The presentation will focus on modeling the novel coronavirus pandemic from the perspective of a nuclear engineer. So using those same kind of tools that we're all familiar with and applying it to this new kind of problem. First, I have to give a bit of a disclaimer. While I am an employee of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the work that I'm presenting today is something that I've done on my own time and doesn't represent the views of the United States government or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So please keep that in mind through the rest of the presentation. So just to outline what we'll be talking about today is first I want to introduce the concept of the SEIR model for the modeling of a pandemic. And then once we sort of lay that groundwork of the basics for pandemic modeling, I'll draw a lot of conceptual parallels between modeling and concepts that a nuclear engineer will be very familiar with. And these are going to include continuity, multiplication, worth, and depletion. And as you see those parallels, I think you'll gain a better understanding of how to approach modeling. And we'll sort of wrap up with a section talking about model tuning and validation, how you can take a model that you've constructed and then make it useful for forecasting. And then wrap up with a few conclusions. So to understand the SEIR model, the first step is understanding an infection progression. So if an individual is exposed to a virus, an individual starts off as being susceptible to contracting that virus. Once they contract the virus, they've been exposed. This represents the period when the virus is in your system, but it's incubating. This refers to like the incubation period. After a while, the person will begin to express symptoms, and that's when a person's considered to be infected. And it's typically at this point that a person is most infectious. So that person can now spread the virus to other susceptible individuals before either recovering from the illness or succumbing to the illness and dying. And so given that progression, the SEIR model tries to track subpopulations within a larger population of those individuals that are susceptible, those individuals that are exposed, those that are infected, and those that fall into this category of removed. And so that'll be people that are no longer infectious because they've either recovered or people that are no longer infectious because they've died from the illness. So that makes sense. We can now talk about the concept of continuity. So I think a nuclear engineer will be very familiar with this concept if they've looked at the neutron transport equation or looked at conservation equations in the context of thermal hydraulics analysis. So like mass conservation or energy conservation. These kinds of continuity equations are developed by relating the rate of change in some quantity to production and loss terms, and they form the basis for a system of differential equations. But instead of, say, thinking of the number of neutrons moving with a particular velocity in a particular direction, we can now think about subpopulations. And so we can take this concept of continuity and apply it to the S, E, I, and R subpopulations in a larger population. And continuity implies that there are production and loss terms within the subpopulations. For example, there'll be a loss term from the susceptible population to the exposed population that represents the infection spreading to another person. And then once that virus incubates, there'll be a person moving from the exposed population to the infected population. Death and recovery rates will dictate whether or not someone becomes a casualty or recovers from the illness. And infectious people can spread the illness. So the number of people in the infected population affects how many people in the susceptible population will become infected. And so this sort of forms the basis for setting up a system of equations looking at these different transition pathways between these subpopulations, keeping in mind the concept of continuity. Now, the novel coronavirus is novel in several ways, and it's important to capture that novelty of the novel coronavirus. One of the important aspects of the coronavirus is that the severity of symptoms can vary very greatly amongst those who become infected. So some people will show mild or no symptoms at all, and this means that there's a large proportion of people that are infected will fall into this category of asymptomatic carriers, people that can spread the illness but don't suffer from the symptoms of the illness. Additionally, we've learned that before manifesting symptoms, that people that are exposed can contribute to transmission of the virus as a kind of pre-symptomatic transmission. So this is another aspect of the novel coronavirus that we'll want to capture in our modeling. And lastly, the system of equations we talked about in the previous slide, this doesn't account for any kind of containment measures that may be exploited due to widespread testing or contact tracing programs along with quarantines. So if there are those kinds of measures in place, that can affect the spread of the illness. So we'll want to capture, if there are contact tracing and quarantine programs, how that affects the spread of the virus. So with that in mind, we can develop a representation of the pandemic using these subpopulations, characterizing the interactions between these subpopulations in this kind of flow chart, and then use the principle of continuity to then just create a system of differential equations that we can solve. And you can see here that there are a lot of pathways. The dashed lines for pre-symptomatic transmission and transmission characterize the interaction between the subpopulations, whereas the solid lines represent transitions. So there'll be a flow, essentially, of people from one of these subpopulations to another. The green dashed line around quarantine represents, if people can be quarantined, this will limit their interaction, so it can reduce the rate of transmission. So with these nuances, we create this, essentially this flow diagram, and then using continuity, develop a system of equations, and we can solve them. I want to talk about some of those equations. There's a lot of detail on the upcoming slides, but I wanted to sort of leave this as a reference if someone wanted to come back and look at and glean more details about the model itself. But I just wanted to talk about, at a high level, some of the terms that go into constructing these equations. The first equation set up here is the rate of change in the susceptible population. And what's important to note here is that that rate of change will depend on factors such as the transmission probability, which is this term beta, and the contact rate, which is this term C. So the contact rate characterizes how frequently people come into contact with each other in such a way that the virus could possibly be transmitted. And the transmission probability, I think, is pretty obvious. And there are some other terms here that are, capturing the fact that, there'll be a different contact rate if someone's in quarantine. And there's a term capturing this pre-symptomatic transmission. But I think the important takeaway is that the parameters here that are key are the transmission probability and the contact rate. If we look at the exposed population, There's a source term for the exposed population that's coming from the transition of susceptible people as they become exposed. Then there's an incubation rate, which characterizes the transition rate from exposed to infected. And that's sort of this minus sigma E term. And then the third term shown here is a term that captures the potential impact of contact tracing being used to put people into quarantine. The details I don't think are very important here, but if you wanted to come back and take a closer look, you can see these equations later. There's the equation for the infected population. In here, we separate out those people that are infected and expressing symptoms from those that are asymptomatic carriers. So we have to take into account the probability of an infection producing symptoms. And then there are two loss terms here characterized by death and recovery. And again, another term related to potential quarantining as a result of diagnostic testing. And lastly, there are equations here for the asymptomatic population and the removed population, which includes, as I said before, people that recover from the illness as well as people that succumb to the illness. So with all those equations, I talked about a number of parameters, and I mentioned some of the very important ones are the transmission probability and the contact rate. But these parameters can be divided into two broad categories, and I call these categories virus parameters versus cultural parameters. So there are parameters in these systems of equations that describe sort of the biological impact of the virus itself, such as transmission probability, this pre-symptomatic transmission effectiveness, the incubation rate, the probability of developing symptoms. So these are parameters that characterize the virus itself. There are also cultural parameters, and these are parameters that are in these systems of equations that will change from one population to another population. So we talked about the SEIR models. Those are all subpopulations within a larger population that you're trying to model. And within that modeled population, there will be cultural factors that affect these parameters, such as the contact rate probably being the most important. But for instance, if you're trying to model a population in a city, the contact rate will tend to be higher there than if you're trying to model a population in a rural area. Some of the parameters here, you'll see I've put them both as a virus parameter and as a cultural parameter. This includes the transmission probability and the death rate. So these can also change from population to population, but in a more subtle way than the contact rate, or a smaller way. For instance, the death rate between different populations can vary depending on the prevalence of certain comorbidity conditions. So if you're trying to model a population, say for one state in the US, if there's a higher prevalence of comorbid conditions in that state than another state, then the death rate may be higher in the former as opposed to the latter. So there is potential for transmission probability and death rate to vary from one population to another. So it's kind of doing double duty as a virus parameter and as a cultural parameter. Also, cultural parameters that are important are the prevalence of testing, as well as any kind of mitigation or containment measures that are in place, and whether or not the populations are complying with those mitigation and containment measures. And these can have significant impacts on the progression of the pandemic. There are some additional equations that are sort of ancillary equations that run on the back end of the model, and these are important for projecting consequent, I want to say resource utilization needs. You can think of them, if you're a nuclear engineer, as like what would be the consequences of a potential scenario. But also there are equations that calculate the rate of testing, the number of cases, and the number of casualties. And calculating the testing, cases, and casualties are important because those we can think of as figures of merit. because there will be data that are collected where the outcome of the model can be compared to those data. So it forms the basis for tuning and validation that we'll talk about later. And for projections, one of the key outputs that you're interested in is, what is going to be the burden on the healthcare system in terms of hospital resource utilization. So there's a system of equations here that looks at how many ICU beds will be needed, how many ventilators will be needed, et cetera. I've included this slide just for reference if someone wanted to come back and look at the material and all the parameters for these ancillary equations. But the big picture here is, these kind of run on the back end, take the results of the SEIR, process that to get to figures of merit that we're interested in for validation, for tuning, and for projecting potential consequences. So now I want to get to the next conceptual parallel, which is multiplication. So if you're an epidemiologist or a virologist, you'll look at the spread of the illness from one person to another, and you'll see that an individual can infect multiple other individuals. And this concept is captured by what's referred to as the viral reproduction number, or R0. And this gives the number of people that an infected person will infect if the population is wholly susceptible. A nuclear engineer might look at this picture of viral reproduction and it will look very familiar because it's very akin to neutron multiplication. So you can think of R0 in the same way that we think of eta or K infinity. But instead of neutrons causing subsequent fissions, it's an infected person creating additional infected persons. And so if we can draw that conceptual parallel between neutron multiplication and viral reproduction, then we can use the same kind of mathematical approaches that we use in analyzing neutron neutronics and dynamics and apply those same methods and concepts to the system of continuity equations that we just developed for an SEIR model. And here, I want to cast the SEIR model in the framework of an eigenvalue problem. So if you are familiar with the neutron diffusion equation, the time-dependent neutron diffusion equation can be recast as an eigenvalue problem. And here we introduce the term K infinity as the inverse of the eigenvalue. And you can solve that equation to get a K effective given the parameters of the neutron diffusion equation. That's sort of what's shown on the left. And this will be very familiar to the nuclear engineers in the audience. Conceptually, we can follow the exact same steps looking at the infected population continuity equation. If we apply the same approach, we can get an expression for K effective in terms of different parameters of the model. But here, instead of representing neutron multiplication, it really represents an infected person's multiplication factor. And in some ways, it is like this R0 term, but this will be time dependent, and it can capture the infected population multiplication will change in response to the spread of the illness, the changes in the subpopulations, as well as the effect of mitigation and containment measures such as social distancing or quarantining. And we can look at the evolution of this multiplication factor with time. I just want to present some hypothetical case studies to show exactly this approach of examining the change in K effective in response to different mitigation strategies in two test cases. So here I'm presenting some hypothetical case studies looking at two different populations, first the District of Columbia and secondly Virginia. In these two cases, there's the initial spread of the disease early on, and this gives us an indication of what R0 is, which in the case of the District of Columbia was about 2.7, and Virginia about 3.2, and this is in the range of values of R0 given in the literature. Then these models capture some of the mitigation policies. In particular, policies that are aimed at social distancing and policies related to mask wearing. And in response to the implementation of those policies, there's a change in K effective with time that is captured. And we can see the importance of these different policies. And here, implementing these kinds of policies to a nuclear engineer will look familiar because it will look like implementing reactivity control devices to shut down a reactor. The idea is that you can insert negative worth through different policies to reduce K effective. And if you reduce K effective below 1, or maybe your policies are insufficient to reduce K effective below 1, that can have significant consequences in terms of what we talked about before, these hospital resource utilization needs. So looking at the District of Columbia and Virginia, while we've shown that these trends in K effective can be similar, in one case, the mitigation is sufficient to drop K effective below 1. And in the other case, it does not drop K effective below 1, even though these graphs have a similar characteristic. You can see that that is very consequential in terms of the hospital resource needs projected over time. And so controlling the spread of the virus with mitigation measures in one hypothetical case study for DC shows that resource hospitalization needs go down, whereas in the case of Virginia, they continue to go up. And so this is showing an example of how mitigation policies can control the infection and how that translates to consequences in terms of hospital resource needs. So I want to talk a little bit about mitigation and containment measures, what those specifically are, what forms the control rods, let's say. One type of mitigation policy is social distancing, and this umbrella refers to all manner of public health policy measures that are aimed at reducing contact rate. So some examples would be public policy measures such as closing schools or closing certain businesses or imposing limits on the size of gatherings. Mask wearing guidance or mask wearing mandates are policies that are directed at encouraging citizens to wear masks, and this is aimed at reducing the transmission probability. In terms of containment measures, testing or temperature monitoring is an approach to determine whether or not people are infected, and then infected people can be segregated in quarantines. And then that will, of course, affect the transmission from infected people to susceptible people. That kind of containment measure could be supplemented with contact tracing that aims to quarantine before they become infectious or infect other people. So social distancing, the way that you can model social distancing is by trying to capture the change in the contact rate in response to whether or not a measure is imposed or revoked. And here, different measures have different strengths of their impact on the contact rate. The weighting for that effect here is derived by looking at cell phone mobility data in response to different kinds of mitigation measures. So in many states in the US, these same kind of social distancing measures were imposed, in some places not at the same times. And there's been like cell phone mobility data collected over that time. So you can sort of look at those two pieces of information to infer how effective certain measures are at reducing contact between people. And that's sort of what is used to calculate the change in contact rate once an order is imposed. When an order is revoked, there's not necessarily a symmetrical change in the contact rate. The modeling has to try and capture that as well. So things like social distancing fatigue can mean that once an order is revoked, the contact rate may actually go up to a higher level than it was before. Alternatively, you may live in a population that's like very timid about returning to normal activities once a social distancing order is revoked. And so that difference needs to be captured in the modeling. And there's a term here for revoking orders that accounts for that. Mask wearing is treated in the model here as having an effect both on protecting the mask wearer from contracting the virus, as well as reducing the probability of an infected person who's wearing a mask from transmitting the virus. So mask wearing has that twofold effect, and that's assumed in the modeling that I've done. So with that in mind, now we can ask the question of what is a sensible public health policy? So the goal of a sensible public health policy portfolio will combine mitigation and containment measures to control the spread of the infection. And what that means is you want to layer a number of different policies, either mitigation or containment strategies, such that altogether they're enough to bring K effective below 1.0. And additionally, since we can calculate the response of K effective with changing policies, we can look at the worth of any individual policy to control the infection. So you can construct a portfolio that has a total worth that's sufficient to bring K effective below 1. And here we would say that sufficient worth is $1. So here I'm providing another case study. This is just an example of different scenarios using that same District of Columbia model, but modeling reopening in May 2020. So this is assuming that at May 6th, all social distancing orders are revoked, but imposing different containment strategies, and then comparing that to a base case of never revoking the social distancing orders. So with perpetual social distancing, as we saw before, K effective was dropped below 1, and that combined worth is about -1 cent. However, if those social distancing orders were revoked and replaced with different mitigation strategies, we can look at the combined worth of that new portfolio. And we can see, for instance, without any containment, the total combined worth is 33 cents, but imposing things like temperature monitoring or temperature monitoring with contact tracing can reduce that worth. And as a consequence of reducing that worth, there can be a significant reduction in the number of casualties. And that's sort of what this example is showing here. The next parallel I'd like to talk about is depletion. And before, this is showing the same two example hypothetical case studies that I showed before of the District of Columbia and Virginia, but it's focusing in a different area, the K effective change in time. And this is looking at the tail end. And what we observe here is this approximately linear decrease in K effective over time. Nuclear engineers will again be very familiar with this concept because this looks a lot like reactivity loss due to depletion. And anyone who's familiar with the linear reactivity model will be very familiar with this concept. Will show that the reactivity slowly decreases. And here in the case of the pandemic modeling, it's because you're moving susceptible people over time from the susceptible population ultimately into the removed population. And that's a lot like the depletion of fuel that you see in a nuclear reactor. And so the concept is quite similar. Now, with a linear reactivity model, you can see where the K effective drops below 1, and that is really indicating where herd immunity is established. So in this context, reactivity limited burnup is very similar to herd immunity. And so with that, I'd like to sort of change gears a bit and talk about, once you have an SEIR model set up, how can you use that model to make useful projections? And in order to make useful projections, one has to take the model that has these virus-specific and population-specific parameters and find some way of prescribing the values of those parameters. So many of those parameters are not well known a priori, but we can use available sources of data for different populations in a process to tune the parameters to fit those data. And then once that is done, then use the model to make projections. And here, the available data would be the number of cases, the number of deaths, and the number of hospitalizations. So this is showing a simple case of looking at case and casualty data and just adjusting the pre and post social distancing contact rates and testing eligibility. And just adjusting these parameters for different for different populations within the US can give somewhat reasonable agreement, with just a minor tuning. This is really encouraging that it's able to capture the trends and the behavior so well, even just making small adjustments to a small subset of parameters. However, we can do better. And this is what motivated me to develop a genetic algorithm to automate the SEIR model tuning. So the tuning is aimed at using all of the available data to quantify the cultural parameters in the model for any given state. And what a genetic algorithm will do is it will make adjustments to those parameters and evaluate them to determine whether or not that fit has like a good fitness. And we'll discuss a little bit the concept of fitness in the following slide. But essentially, it sort of randomly explores different values of these parameter sets, and as the agreement with data gets better, those values are sort of retained and passed on to the next step. And so this approach can automate the tuning process, and it also will allow us to perform multiple simulations to estimate error bands in the fitted parameters. So in using the genetic algorithm for SEIR model tuning, the available data for tuning are the cases, deaths, and hospitalizations. And these, like as I talked about earlier, are calculated by those ancillary equations, to produce these figures of merit for comparison of data. Then here is the fitness function that I've developed. It has some weighting to weight more recent data more heavily than historical data. And it takes into account cases, deaths, and hospitalizations, and sort of calculates a parameter that sort of says how well the model does in predicting all of these quantities. It sort of lumps that all together into one parameter. And this is just a nuance here, but the smaller the fitness value is, the better the fit is. So the genetic algorithm is actually looking for the least fit agent in this particular case. The features of the genetic algorithm that are important, are first assessing the fitness. There's a step in the process that models selection, and that will call bad parameter sets and prevent them from reproducing during an iteration of the genetic algorithm. Reproduction and mutation is how sets of parameters propagate to the next step. So if they do a pretty good job, they have a chance of moving forward into the next step, and then they'll be subject to some mutation. In addition, good models will have the possibility to reproduce through like a simulated mating, and genetic crossover is modeled in that step. Finally, just looking at that that simple tuning, I've implemented a coarse search acceleration to speed up the early search by just looking at contact rate on its own to sort of set things up, and then the genetic algorithm can operate once like a good guess for contact rate is established. And lastly, I use an approach of slicing the genome into subgenomes, and then iterate in such a way as to try and mimic punctuated equilibrium. And so punctuated equilibrium allows the algorithm to have sort of like these spurts of, it allows it to every now and again explore a whole lot of opportunities. So there can be like a jump in the fitness during one of these stages of punctuated equilibrium. Some of the preliminary results here are shown for some states in the US. And there's variation in these parameters from population to population, and the agreement between the cases and deaths data is very good. I will say that this work is not complete. There's another step that has to be done. So once the genetic algorithm runs for a given population, it will generate parameter values and an error bands around those parameter values. But that's not enough to then just say I can trust the projections. What has to be done is those parameter values have to be correlated with a set of surrogate data. An example would be like that cell phone mobility data that I talked about earlier. So you can look at variations in the contact rate from one population to another and see if that correlates well with surrogate data such as that cell phone mobility data in the case of contact rate. For the other parameters, you'll need other surrogate data. A good candidate is serological survey data. And then that can be used to compare seroprevalence, and that'll give you a good idea of whether or not the results of the genetic algorithm are meaningful. That step, it's the stuff I haven't done yet, but that's like what would need to be done to then verify that the operation of the genetic algorithm is giving meaningful results. But regardless, I wanted to present some results, and here I'm going to show 4 different cases. And these 4 different cases represent 4 what I call meta scenarios in the US. And this is to give sort of a sampling of the performance of an SEIR model to how well it can capture hospitalization cases and deaths in sort of 4 different paradigms. So this first case I'm showing is for the District of Columbia. In the District of Columbia, mitigation measures were imposed early and were consistently imposed throughout the duration of the pandemic. So they were not really relaxed at any time. Or if they were relaxed, there was just a small degree of relaxation, especially for like the period that I'm simulating here. And you can see that the SEIR model very well captures the behavior and trends in the key figures of merit. Another example is the case in New York, which was the epicenter of the pandemic early on. So this is capturing a case where mitigation and containment measures were imposed, but only after a significant period of time of viral spread. And you can see that the model, again, is really able to capture well the trends in these major figures of merit. In the case of Virginia, I call this the touch and go meta scenario. This is where different mitigation measures were imposed. They were staggered in how they were imposed, and then were relaxed and reimposed. So the idea was to sort of like wait for case numbers to come down and then relax measures, and then as things turned around to like reimpose them. And here, while there are differences in the hospitalization rate, the key takeaway here, I think, is the flexibility of the model to sort of capture, that you get these kinds of changes in hospitalization and, case and the number of cases when those kinds of policies are tried. And then the last case I wanted to talk about is a case for Texas where social distancing mitigation measures were imposed very late. So there was a hesitancy in imposing social distancing measures. And in this kind of scenario, we can see that the model is able to pretty well capture the behavior in the changes in hospitalization cases and deaths. And sort of like a last step, I also did some comparison to the IHME model from the University of Washington. And this sort of serves as a verification of the SEIR model. And while there are some differences, and there's differencing in the modeling approach adopted after this projected line that I'm showing here. But overall, the conclusion here is that the SEIR model at least is predicting the same order of magnitude values as the IHME model in terms of hospital resource utilization, which is one of the key figures of merit. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to say that the SEIR epidemiological model is very similar to the models that are used for dynamic nuclear reactor systems analysis. And because of that similarity, I'm hoping that this presentation at least has, for the nuclear engineers in the audience, kind of demystified how modeling works, what parameters are used to characterize the pandemic and how those models are used to make projections. In developing my own SEIR model, here I found that it was pretty straightforward to take into account the novel aspects of the novel coronavirus and build that into the SEIR framework. There's multiple sources of data across several of the states, and that can be used to adjust certain parameters in the SEIR model. And by doing that, make better predictions of resource utilization and to project casualties. But also, a validated SEIR model can be used to evaluate potential public health policies. And if we apply the concept of worth, this can be used as a framework for developing a sensible public health policy portfolio that sizes the number of containment and mitigation measures properly to control the pandemic, without being too draconian or without being too lax. And so with that, I'd like to conclude and leave a little bit of time for any questions.
All right, thanks so much, Pete. Do we have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat or just chime in. Kaylin?
Yeah. Hi. So I'm just curious what the motivation behind this work that you did is. Is it just purely for SciComm and understanding for the nuclear community, drawing those parallels is interesting? Or was there another motivation for it?
Well, personally, I wanted to better understand sort of what the projected course of the pandemic would be. So the work that I did was primarily in the spring and summer of last year. So it was really like a personal motivation to better understand the results of modeling, and then to hopefully have a toolkit where I could scrutinize different leading models, because I think if you'll recall, there were a number of models that were being referenced in the news that were giving very different projections in terms of the course of the pandemic. So a lot of this work sort of stemmed from a personal motivation to better understand other people's models. In the end, I found that the best way to understand what was going on was to kind of do it myself.
Other questions? So I'm sort of interested in the depletion analogy. The suggestion being that you were sort of depleting your pool of susceptible people, but I mean, we know that I'm trying to figure out the way to phrase the question. I mean, at the time spans you were looking at, the infection rate, the historical cumulative infection rate was pretty small. So the pool of susceptible people was quite large and remained large, did it not?
Yes.
And so is that really, are there sort of multipliers, all the other parameters are these multipliers that kind of contribute to the fact that the pool of susceptible people can remain large and still get this depletion effect?
Well, if you'll notice, we can go back to the graph. So this depletion effect here, you can see it's incredibly slow. The reason it's incredibly slow is because there are mitigation measures in place, and those mitigation measures reduce transmission. And so it's exactly the case you're talking about, is that because we have effective mitigation measures in place, such as social distancing and mask wearing, contact tracing and quarantining, that means that the fraction of the population that's still susceptible remains relatively large. And so that this process of depletion is slow when you have effective mitigation and containment measures.
Okay, Kate, I think Kate and Young Feng maybe had a question too, but Kate first.
Yeah, I do. Very interesting talk. The relationship, everything's kind of intertwined. but I do have a question. There was a lot of different variables, right? And you talked a little bit about how some of them are more important than others, things like that. But because it's so novel, and I think we're all still learning about it, did you look at sort of the sensitivity to those different variables? Because, you know, we might not necessarily know their exact values, right? What is the rate of spread, or what is the actual death rate, or you know, how many asymptomatic people are spreading to other people? Did you look at kind of the sensitivity of those different variables?
Yeah, so this is a very excellent question. The sensitivity data kind of falls out of doing the genetic algorithm tuning, because you just run so many different sets of parameters that you kind of get that cross-correlation and sensitivity data out of it. But the sort of the next step, and a step I have not done yet, is you then want to do an uncertainty analysis for the projections, right? So once you have all that sensitivity data, you can combine that with the error bands that the genetic algorithm sort of puts out, or you can use other sources of uncertainty data, such as clinical trials. You know, for some of the virus parameters, you can sort of get some of these from clinical trial data. But then to then impose that uncertainty band on a projection, right? So this is something that would be like akin to, if you're familiar with like best estimate LOCA plus uncertainty approaches, you could do exactly the same kind of uncertainty analysis where you have these figures of merits in terms of hospitalizations, right? So instead of peak Clyde temperature, you have hospitalization. Instead of core-wide oxidation, you have ventilators, right? And instead of like, here's my critical heat flux correlation uncertainty, you would have here's like my contact rate uncertainty. You would just use the same approach and the same methods once you got to that point. It's just I haven't taken that step. But you know, after the genetic algorithm, you kind of have an estimate for the error bands, and you have the sensitivity coefficients. So it's yeah, it's something that could be done, should be done. I just am not doing it.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Yongfeng, did you have a question? Or?
Yes, this is Yongfeng here. I'm interested when you calibrate your model or validate your model. For this case, at least the quality of the data is something should be concerned, right? Sometimes how much of the cases are reported basically depends on how many people are tested. And if there is no data, then there's a big spike the following day. So is there any practice, any kind of perspectives regarding dealing with those data?
Yes, this is a very excellent question. I have like a few things I should bring up. The first is there are biases in the data. So one of the key features of the model that I've presented here, and I sort of glossed over it in the presentation, is that you need to be able to calculate the number of diagnostic test results in order to compare to the case data. The cases will include, especially early on, and especially when testing was very heavily rationed, will include diagnoses based on symptoms alone, as opposed to diagnoses based on diagnostic test results. This introduces a bias into the data early on and was the motivating factor for putting a time-dependent weighting into the fitness function.
I see.
Second is the model right now inherently assumes that diagnostic testing is rationed, which was the case early in the pandemic, you know, but as states went through substantial efforts, several states now are not rationing testing in the same way. And so that change in the ground conditions means that if you wanted to apply this model for periods of time after the summer, there would have to be adjustments made to account for testing availability. So that's a weakness in the current modeling approach. It's an assumption that was a good assumption early in the pandemic, but is no longer a good assumption. So that's another aspect of the data that are a problem, especially doing tuning. So there's some future work that needs to be done, but I think the key element of it here is that you have the SEIR model that's looking at whole populations. You need to somehow take those results and translate it to the figures of merit that are comparable to your data. And here there was an assumption made that was good early on, but it's no longer good. So some additional modeling work would need to be done to advance what's going on here. But it's something that's being taken into account, say, like in the University of Washington IHME model.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
And so is that kind of change just allowing one of your parameters to be time varying, or it's not a change in the fundamental set of equations, it's more a change in what you assume that.
Right. So there's this parameter that I call like testing eligibility that relates to like how testing was rationed, and it was like a symptom-based approach. That would need to be adjusted so that that parameter would be time dependent. So that's something that could be done. It's just something I have not done.
I guess if you make it truly time dependent, it becomes it makes it more of a nonlinear system potentially. No, I guess it's still linear. It's just time varying constants. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but it's just it will be a little more difficult to do. There'll eventually be a point where you kind of like have a saturated testing capacity. So you may want to use the rationing approach early on, and then maybe neglect the case data and just use the hospitalization and death data until you reach a point where, you know, testing is saturated. So you sort of like remove that part of the fitness function, so you're not looking at case data and the part of time where it's difficult to characterize testing eligibility. So that would be like an alternative approach, is changing the fitness function as opposed to changing the parameter itself, and then just let it be one in the long term. So there are, you know, different approaches. My peer reviewers brought that up as like an alternative approach, but I've not implemented that.
I have more questions, but I'll let other people jump in. Young Feng, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I got another question regarding in this model, because now we're moving into the vaccine regime. How that can be considered in this model?
Yeah, I get this question every time. So I made a slide in my backup slides.
Great.
Is that vaccination looks like depletion. So if you're vaccinating people, you're going to be vaccinating susceptible people, and then you're moving them into the removed population. So they're no longer going to be susceptible to the infection, but they don't go through the infection. So it just creates this additional pathway here, and then the vaccination rate would dictate how frequently you're moving people from susceptible to removed. So it'd be adding this pathway and then characterizing that and incorporating it into the continuity equation. But the analog would be depletion.
I see. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah, so it could be built in. I haven't built it in. And then you would have to look at sort of like the ramping up of vaccine availability. And if you wanted to get like really detailed in the modeling, you know, there's vulnerable population as being vaccinated first. There's some detail in the model about capturing the difference between the essential and the non-essential workforce. But, you know, that should be, that difference should probably be captured better to do a better job with modeling the vaccination if you live in a state where the essential workforce is being prioritized for vaccination.
So is this all on GitHub somewhere?
So if you want to learn more, I've published the work presented here in 2 papers. If people have access to the slides, they can get at these 2 papers. An early version of the code itself is available through Journal Global Health Reports. That's on my like 0.266 version. I stopped developing it at like the 0.5 version, which includes like the genetic algorithm and all those fancy things. So that stuff is not really out there and available. But as I said, I think the key message I would like to leave everybody with is that if you're a nuclear engineer, you have all the tools you need to not only understand modeling, but to do modeling. And I'm hoping, you know, if you wanted to sort of pick up these papers and read them, it'll give you everything you would need to then scrutinize the models that are being maintained and are being used, such as the University of Washington IHME model. So that when you see those results, you understand what's under the hood and are able to understand, what goes into making those projections and how realistic those projections are.
Sure. I mean, my reason for asking was not simply actually for the model itself, but I think what I can presume is that the process by which you developed this model over time added much of the complexity that we saw here. Like, you maybe started with a simpler SEIR model that had fewer parameters in it, and then you realized that there was some effect you wanted to account for, and some coefficient that was a single coefficient got split into three, product of three things, so you could tease out certain effects and things like that. And so I think being able to sort of, in hindsight, witness the process by which you developed this model would be interesting pedagogically in and of itself.
I would absolutely like to comment on this, is that I originally set out to do this approach using a stochastic method.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, maybe not every nuclear engineer, but at least the neutronics people will be like, oh, like a stochastic method makes complete sense. Then you can, if you did a stochastic method, then you'd be able to capture something that my model cannot capture, which would be super spreader events.
Yep.
Where you can have a high concentration of people just all of a sudden gather somewhere, right? And a stochastic method could do something like that. And it could simulate, that effect that has on the progression of the pandemic. So there are many advantages to using a stochastic approach. Nuclear engineers will be very familiar with the concept of using a stochastic approach, but it's too computationally intensive. So I think the University of Washington could do something like that. National Lab could do something like that. The CDC could do something like that. But it's just as a person that's doing this on my off time, I needed something that would run in a reasonable amount of time on a personal computer.
Sure.
So I had to abandon the stochastic approach early on. But it was definitely an interesting part of the overall journey, moving from stochastic to deterministic methods.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end. Thanks for that presentation and for, I think, that walkthrough modeling. It's really made me think, I guess my last question in the sort of pedagogy of it, I think, is something that's useful to try and drive home to students, is the process of just taking the things and scaffolding that into a model that, and refining it and updating it. So thanks a lot. With that,
and of course, the value of, learning by doing.
Yeah.
Just, putting some stuff in the sandbox, playing around with it, seeing what you can do. And ultimately, like, I managed to meet some success and get some good results. But, the amateurs out there, I encourage you to use the same kind of tools that you've learned in your classes and in your professional experience to give something like this a shot, because it will completely demystify the whole modeling, and it'll give you the language to understand what's going on, and you'll have like a real, much better feel for the meaningfulness of the results of projections that are being reported in the news.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. That's it for today, everyone, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks again, Peter.
Yep, and thank you for the opportunity.
Right.